This episode is brought to you by The Skeptical Buddha, The Tao of Science, my book, which is a thoughtful discourse on Eastern philosophy and how it helped birth ideas required for science and skepticism and the way it fell behind in the face of new evidence. This book discusses the long history of both philosophies as well as the tenets and variations within the varying sects, along with psychology and our own natural biases. It discusses how to counter our natural biases using science and the underlying concepts of meditation and mindfulness, a more complex understanding of how science operates than most of the public understands, and why it is the best tool we have to discover truth and reality, as well as philosophical ideas we might embrace as technology progresses. The material is packaged in a way that the average person can understand, with rich illustrations to draw the reader in and feel at peace. So as always, thank you all for watching this as a video or listening to this as a podcast, which I'm sure was completely uncontroversial to anyone, especially to the YouTube monetization team. So if you found this useful, please donate to my Patreon. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have almost 700 videos on my channel that I've made over the past 11 years on religion, science, psychology, and politics. Please go check them out, and if your site has the option, like, rate, review, and comment. A special thanks goes out to Kendall Copperberg, Mylon Mia, Ogrel, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Joe Taylor for their $10 or more Wapawet level donations. I'm always humbled by the fact that they find my work worth funding and worth driving me forward. Thank you all. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening. I'm going to freak out so many Americans, but the more I know about both nations, the more I can't help but see them as similar in many ways, but for completely different reasons. Here are the top 10 ways North Korea and the United States are similar. Number 10, they believe they are well loved by the world. According to the North Korean mythos, almost every nation around the world loves North Korea and views them as a benevolent ally, and people are trying to defect all the time to get in. This was almost never true about this nation. In America, we are all told everyone wants to come to the US. This was true for many decades, but not so much any longer. This is now only true about people from poorer nations who are either desperate because we have destabilized their nations for decades, like in Central America, or they can send way more money back to their families than they ever could in their country just thanks to currency exchange rates, or people who are well established thanks to good social safety nets in their nations and just want to live somewhere else for the experience. People aren't clamoring to get in because they love America. It's just better than what they have thanks to the constant interference in their nation, mostly by us in Europe. Number 9, they believe they are well respected by the world. The North Korean mythos believes the rest of the world respects the Kim family leadership and military prowess. America was once the world leader, and for a little while we used quick-action military force to negotiate peace through our position in the world. Think of the Balkan crisis. We were respected. Then we went into two massively corrupt, bungled 10 and 20-year-long wars, leaving them almost worse places than we went in, with people having PTSD triggers just from a sunny day because that's when drone strikes happen. Then our respect plummeted once even more for the next reason. Number 8, they have demagogues as leaders. The Kim family is built on cruelty, bombastic corruption, and lies. Kim Il-sung only got into power by buying his way up the chain in the Kremlin with booze, and only because its original freedom-fighting leader, Choman Sik, refused to be Stalin's puppet and adopt a Stalinist dictatorship. The entire family is incompetent, corrupt, and has created a blind faith cult following among most of the population. Donald Trump squandered every bit of his daddy's money he was ever given, even lost money on a casino, which should be mathematically impossible, especially if you have no ethics like the Trumps don't. Most of his foreign and much of his domestic real estate has direct ties to money laundering, and most of his domestic loans come from shady Russian-based companies because no legitimate bank would ever loan him anything based on his credit record. And just like the Kims, is treated as a messiah by a percentage of the population. He bungled everything he did in business and in the government, never got an infrastructure package through he promised, even with both houses of Congress in power, handled COVID so badly it's estimated that several 100,000 people would still be alive had he actually followed the CDC and told people to inject themselves with disinfectants. The medical supply chain was littered with corrupt deals, slowing down much-needed COVID supplies, So many of us had to help 3D print gear for hospital employees like face shields, and the vaccine rollout was an utter mess with zero planning. The United States stopped being respected by the rest of the world at that point, but his fans still believe everyone loves us just like how North Korea does. Number 7, they both have information silos. In the DPRK, you get your news from one source, the state. Unless you have had thumb drives smuggled in, you don't get any other news. In the US, you have all the news at your fingertips, but we are such a massive nation that, especially in pre-internet days, getting any news was always US-centric. And you couldn't easily get the views of other nations about us unless you dug hard and cared enough. Once algorithm bubbles were created in the internet, it's become the same for many, as they get their news from purely right-wing, or for a tiny minority, radical left-leaning news bubbles that misinformation folks can infiltrate and people just accept and believe. We have all this access to other points of view, but now we might as well be a collection of people with state-run propaganda, but all living in different nations because we feel righteous that the other side is awful. Number 6, they believe they are one of the best in the world. North Koreans until recently were told that their nation was the best in the world. Only recently did Kim Jong-un admit that their infrastructure was terrible and was going to fix it. Americans believe their nation is the best in the world. It used to be, with the rest of the world decimated by war. We got lazy and the rest of the world has surpassed us in education, health standards, and much of the rest of the world has surpassed us in education, health, standards of living, low homelessness, low poverty, income equality, time off with family, low incarceration, union membership, voter turnout, wages, and happiness. We are now just number 1 in our size of military and some of the highest in obesity, suicide, income inequality, overwork, homelessness, incarceration, mass shootings, deaths from treatable illnesses, union busting, uninsured, student debt, feeling isolated, desperation, and depression. Number 5, they have a small body of people who make the real calls. While the Kim family is technically the head, they can't do anything without the support of the party elites. It's why it's technically a democratic republic. So long as a group of people vote on things and it's not an absolute monarchy, it is technically a democratic republic, even if it's not universal suffrage. The United States technically has universal suffrage, but with 6 companies owning most of the media, 8 owning most of the food we buy, Wall Street traders able to completely wreck the economy through deregulation, 17% of Americans controlling half the Senate, and lobbyists being an incredibly lucrative job, we have a voice, but is way more muted than it should be, and often we vote based on badly curated information against our own interests. Number 4, war and violence are idealized. In North Korea, America is the big bad evil, and children are taught from day one to hate and be ready to kill us if a war ever breaks out. There's even a famous children's cartoon called Squirrel and Hedgehog, where they brutally massacre American soldiers to defend their motherland. And I mean brutal. It is just insane, like impalement. In the US, we treat anything sexual as something to censor, but in Europe, our PG-13 movies with violence get an R rating, and war is viewed as a terrible but necessary evil. In the US, war is idealized, made to look badass, and it's a moral duty to go to war and kill people to protect your nation from insert evil subhuman enemy here who wants to take your freedom. How they will take your freedom exactly? I've got no idea. It's why we plunged blindly into the decades-long wars and gave the military everything they wanted under the blind notion of supporting the troops, then of course dumped and then abandoned them the second they got home and needed mental and physical help. Number 3, they demonize their enemies as subhuman. In North Korea, we Americans are the absolute and utter enemy, bent on murdering every last one of them. We have no feelings other than hate and killing all that is good. In the US, we do the exact same thing. We did it with the Muslims and the generic terrorists after 9/11. So much so that for every terrorist we killed, we probably killed an equal amount of innocent people, but that's okay because they're all the same subhuman creature who would have become terrorists later. We imprisoned people without cause, tortured, and brutalized them, all in the name of protecting our nation from these unfeeling monsters. We have done it in our undocumented immigrants as well, treating them as blood-sucking, mooching parasites, even though often we are why they needed to be here because we destabilized their nation, so our companies could keep running their nations as feudal kingdoms for bananas and sugar. Bananas and sugar. These people are also some of the hardest working you can find and have zero access to most of our benefit programs because they're undocumented and foreign. You know, simultaneously stealing our jobs and being lazy. Number 2, they both abuse the term communism and socialism. Prior to the Third International Workingmen's Association, communism and socialism meant the exact same thing. They meant that workers owned their own means of production, ideally through unions and bottom-up government. Lenin decided this was not feasible in the short term thanks to the worst civil war in history at that time. So he created state capitalism, which was top-down, double representative democracy through the unions and co-ops, and controlled the unions and co-ops, and put Marx's actual definition off as an end goal in a decade or two. Lenin died, and suddenly, Stalin took state capitalism to the next level, and double representative democracy suppressed anyone by picking the leaders to be voted on, locking in the term communism to be synonymous with dictatorship. People all over the Soviet Union, including the Bolsheviks, tried to get Stalin to return democracy, but he suppressed them brutally and then went about setting up his own little Stalins around the world. Only Vietnam, Laos, and maybe Cuba were able to avoid Stalinism and still be communist. Trotsky started his own Fourth International and distinguished himself as a socialist, and socialism has become synonymous with democratic socialism thanks to Bernie Sanders. The Kim family became one of many little Stalins, but with their own twist of religious cult of personality and blind faith. Marx would be appalled that this ideology was supposedly inspired by him. America, on the other hand, happily spread the notion that all communism and socialism was equal to Stalinism and meant dictatorship because a government that could give you everything could also take it away. They also told us that people in communism all got paid the same no matter how hard you work, which was only ever true among the peasant farming co-ops. If you worked beyond your quota or took a higher demand job like a doctor, you got paid more. They then associated the welfare state with communism, which are two completely different things and used by successful nations around the world to some degree or another, including the US. Communism was supposed to be about pre-distribution, where workers own their own labor instead of a capitalist with money skimming more off of labor of their workers, and the redistribution was only to return the money skimmed by those capitalists, after which people and co-op owned companies could rise and fall based on their own merit with a social safety net like every other nation. However, 52% of Americans are left-phobic thanks to misinformation and the Red Scare, and treat leftists like they are calling for the return of slavery and an end to democracy. To the point that the right in the country called Democrats communists, all the while trying to do everything they can to weaken or end democracy. Number 1, they are in complete denial that they have the highest prison populations in the world. Bar none. North Korea has the highest population of any nation in the world. If you screwed up and angered the state, you and 3 generations of your family went to a prison camp. This helped the cult of personality thrive. See how awful they are? The problem is, we don't have numbers, just estimates. But by all accounts, they have the highest prison population in the world. However, America is in denial that while we look in horror at the DPRK's prison numbers, we are just fine being a close second to them, as I can't find exact prison numbers, but in 1991 we had the highest prison population in the world at 426 prisoners for every 100,000. Apartheid South Africa was at 333 for every 100,000, took number 2 spot, and the Soviet Union took number 3 with 268 prisoners per person. Now we're at 641 per 100,000 in prison or jail. 0.64% of the population, and for-profit prisons continue to make bank, and white people get black people's votes thanks to prison gerrymandering, where prisoners are counted as living in the prison county instead of where they lived before the arrest, usually strategically placed in white areas. We're freaking out that China at the moment, if the numbers on Xinjiang and the re-education camps are correct, the most extreme numbers, that they have 2/3 less prisoners than we do. We set the moral standard for the world and are shocked when people actually live up to even close to it. It's because of this that pretty much every other nation who commits human rights abuses can just point at the US and say, hey, at least we aren't the US. Until we fix our incarceration system, shut up about how communism has always led to tyranny. The only difference is, unlike in socialist nations, the US has an underclass that lives in fear of the police, and the higher class are delusionally paranoid about getting treated the same way under socialism because they have no problem with the undesirables living under an oppressive system. It's a similar class system that was used by fascism. If the DPRK is rightly called a police state, then what the hell does that make the US? In these 10 ways, the US US is in practice very similar to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, just with some extra steps. So as always, thank you all for watching this as a video or listening to this as a podcast, which I'm sure was completely uncontroversial to anyone, especially to the YouTube monetization team. So if you found this useful, please donate to my Patreon. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have almost 700 videos on my channel that I've made over the past 11 years on religion, science, psychology, and politics. Please go check them out, and if your site has the option, like, rate, review, and comment. A special thanks goes out to Kendall Copperberg, Mylon Mia, Ogrel, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Joe Taylor for their $10 or more Wapawet level donations. I'm always humbled by the fact that they find my work worth funding and worth driving me forward. Thank you all. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.